Welcome to Learn Medical Spanish. Today I'm going to go over some medication instructions. So if you want to tell your patient how to use a medication and sometimes what the purpose is and things like that. So I'll get into that in just a second, but a couple quick things to mention. One is if you haven't already got the beginner lessons for providers, that's something that I'll email you if you go to learnmedicalspanish.org/lessons. So these are 5 lessons, really high yield for providers. So if you haven't already done that, highly recommended. You can head over there. And then one other thing is credit to Rory Foster. He's been on the podcast a couple times talking about immersion trips and other things. I got some of the vocab that I'm using today from a resource that he created. All right, so let's talk about these medication instructions. So we're going to be kind of building the instructions using something like you need to, take this form of the medication with this frequency or sometimes at a certain time of day or what have you, things like that. So let me give you a couple examples in Spanish, and then I'll tell you what they mean in English, and then we'll start going through the vocab, and then eventually I'll kind of quiz you by giving you some examples in English and have you translate them into Spanish with the whole sentences. All right, so here's a couple examples in Spanish. Puede darle una cucharadita de acetaminofén cada 4 a 6 horas para bajar la fiebre y el dolor. So think a little bit about what that means. And here's what it means. It means you can give him or her a teaspoon of acetaminophen every 4 to 6 hours to treat the fever or pain, or to lower the fever or pain. So see how we're kind of building out that whole sentence. It's like a full instruction about how to use a medication. And then here's one other slightly shorter example in Spanish. Hay que tomar una pastilla todos los días con las comidas. So that means one should take a pill every day with food. All right, so that's a couple examples of what we're trying to learn here. And of course, we won't cover everything, but I'm sure you can learn some useful vocabulary and kind of learn how to build some sentences that'll be useful as we go through this. All right, so first, let's go over some forms of medications, medication forms. All right, so I'm going to say them in English and then give you a chance to think about it for a second. So I'll just kind of quiz you through several words about forms of medications. So the first one is syrup. So like an oral medication meaning syrup. El jarabe. El jarabe. Next word is medication. El medicamento. El medicamento. The next word is medicine. So just like in English, these are kind of synonymous, but it's useful to know both. So medicine. La medicina. La medicina. Next one kind of means like a liquid you might give IV. So like an IV medication. El suero. El suero. The needle. La aguja. La aguja. The syringe. La jeringa. La jeringa. The bottle or jar. La botella. La botella. Or a similar word is el frasco. El frasco. How about the tablespoon? La cucharada. La cucharada. And of course, if you want to say a tablespoon, you wouldn't say la, you'd say una. Una cucharada. Like one tablespoon, a tablespoon. All right, how about the teaspoon? Sounds similar to tablespoon. La cucharadita. La cucharadita. The injection. La inyección. La inyección. The pill, and there's going to be 2 words for pill here. So I'll give you kind of the one that's maybe more common first, at least in my experience. La pastilla. La pastilla. And another word for pill. La píldora. La píldora. Next, the prescription. La receta. La receta. And lastly, on these forms, we're going to go over, how would you say half of something? So we'll just say half of a pill. Media pastilla. Media pastilla. Okay, so that was a bunch of forms of medications, and there's a couple other forms of medications we'll go over. So let's go over a couple of topical ones, some topical forms. All right, so first one is the ointment. How would you say the ointment? El ungüento. El ungüento. The cream. La crema. La crema. The drop. Or drops, plural, is probably better. So let's just do drops. Las gotas. Las gotas. Or una gota, dos gotas, right? Depending on the sentence. All right. The patch. El parche. El parche. And this is sort of topical. Different route of administration. How about the inhaler? El inhalador. El inhalador. And we've got a synonym here, which is la pompa. I hadn't personally ever heard that, but it's Rory included it in this lesson here. So la pompa sounds kind of like pump, so just in case you ever hear that. All right, so those are a bunch of different forms of medications. If you need to review, feel free to rewind and go over those again. And then we're going to go over a list of some routes of administration and then some frequencies of administration. So there's 2 more kind of categories there. And then after we get that, we'll go through some practice sentences. All right, so routes of administration. How about by mouth? Por boca. Por boca. By inhalation. Por inhalación. Por inhalación. Below the tongue. Debajo de la lengua. Debajo de la lengua. In the eye. En el ojo. En el ojo. And then maybe right or left, so ojo derecha, ojo izquierdo. Izquierdo. In the ear. En el oído. En el oído. And if you said oreja, don't be confused. So oreja is the external ear, and oído kind of means the internal ear. So if you said oreja, they would understand, but this is probably a better way to say it, referring to eardrops. All right, how about by rectum or in the rectum? Por el recto. Por el recto. And yes, that word recto also means straight. So, all right. So what about by, like through, same phrase, but we'll just exchange it with vagina. So it'll mean like by vagina or in the vagina. Por la vagina. Por la vagina. And last one, in the affected area, so especially for like a topical cream or something, in the affected area. En el área afectada. En el área afectada. All right, so those were routes of administration. Again, if you need to review, feel free to rewind a couple minutes to the beginning of that section. And then let's go over some frequencies. So things like how often to use the medication. All right, so what about X number of times per day? So we'll just say 3 times per day as an example. 3 times per day. 3 veces al día. 3 veces al día. How about before doing something? So how about before going to bed? Antes de acostarse. Antes de acostarse. And yeah, we'll do another one similar to that where we say like a half hour before, but yeah, actually let's just do that right now. So how about a half hour before breakfast or having breakfast? Media hora antes de desayunar. Media hora antes de desayunar. So like a PPI, for example, if you're taking it before breakfast. All right, so what about every blank hours? So just for this example, we'll just do every 8 hours. Cada 8 horas. Cada 8 horas. With food. Or with meals. Con las comidas. Con las comidas. With a lot of water. Con mucha agua. Con mucha agua. When needed, when it's necessary. Cuando es necesario. Cuando es necesario. And you could also make an argument that could be in subjunctive, like cuando sea necesario, so if you don't know if it's going to be necessary. Little grammar note there for you, but either way, they'd understand. All right. How about after something? After getting up in the morning, after getting out of bed. Después de levantarse. Después de levantarse. All right, so we've got a few more frequencies, and I was just noticing as I went through these that some of these are not actually frequencies. but they kind of are. Like when we say with meals, that's sort of a frequency, but also a way of doing it, like with food. And then with water was not really a frequency, but so it's mixed in there. Sorry about that. All right, so a couple more frequencies though. How about daily? And there's probably several ways to say this, so we'll just do a couple. So you could say diario, diario, or if it's part of a sentence, you might say a diario. All right, what about every day, which is similar, of course? Todos los días. Todos los días. Or if you wanted to say once a day. Una vez al día. Una vez al día. So as you can gather, those basically all mean the same thing, but it's just kind of maybe expanding your vocab a little bit if you have these slightly different ways of saying it, and you can also understand those phrases. Okay, so how about in the morning? Por la mañana. Por la mañana. And then we'll do the afternoon and the evening. So how about in the afternoon? Por la tarde. Por la tarde. And in the evening or the night. Por la noche. Por la noche. And then the last one on these frequencies is every other day. And it'll sound like one day yes, one day no. Un día sí, un día no. Un día sí, un día no. All right, so that kind of covers the vocab that we're going to go over today. But let's do a few practice sentences to kind of tie it together. All right, so I'm going to say these practice sentences in English, and then I'll let you think about them and say them a couple times in Spanish, just like we've been doing with the shorter terms. All right, so the first one is, you need to take one pill 3 times a day. And just as a quick note, I think I forgot to say this earlier, but we're using a few of the Medical Spanish cheater commands that I went over with Rory Foster in a previous episode. So it's probably about 5 episodes ago, maybe slightly more than that. So if you look for Medical Spanish cheater commands, that's some of what we're using here. So just in case you need to review that as an FYI. But the sentence is, you need to take one pill 3 times a day. Necesita tomar una pastilla 3 veces al día. Necesita tomar una pastilla 3 veces al día. And just for fun, that rhymes. But see how we're using various things that we learned, like the word for a pill and then 3 times a day. Those were 2 separate things that you learned during this lesson. And then the cheater command was necesita tomar, you need to take. So you don't have to actually do a real command like tome, but you just said you need to take. All right, so necesita tomar una pastilla 3 veces al día. All right, so the next one is, you should take this medication with meals. So again, you should, that's one of those cheater commands, but you should take this medication with meals. Debe tomar este medicamento con comidas. Debe tomar este medicamento con comidas. So again, that's building. We're using these building blocks. With food or with meals was con comidas. This medication was este medicamento. And then you should take, debe tomar. All right. Next sentence is, you have to take this pill a half hour before bedtime. Tiene que tomar esta pastilla media hora antes de acostarse. Tiene que tomar esta pastilla media hora antes de acostarse. So again, the building blocks there are half an hour before bed is media hora antes de acostarse, or in other words, a half hour before laying down. This pill, esta pastilla, what would be the other way to say this pill? Esta píldora. And then you have to take is that cheater command, tiene que tomar. All right, so here's another practice sentence. You can take this pill every other day. Puede tomar esta pastilla un día sí, un día no. Puede tomar esta pastilla un día sí, un día no. So our building blocks there, this pill is the same one as the last sentence. Every other day, we're saying one day yes, one day no. Un día sí, un día no. And the cheater command was puede tomar. So again, if you want to review the cheater commands, that was a few episodes back, maybe 5 or so. All right, so those were the medication instructions. And so if you want some homework, a good way to practice after a lesson like this would be to turn off the podcast, but then see if you can just make up like 5 sentences of your own with a kind of similar format, but using slightly different terminology. Like say, use the cream in the affected area twice per day, for example. Right? Or you could use a cheater command and say you need to use the cream in the affected area twice per day. That's just one example. So you can remove or add or subtract or mix and match all the different phrases, the different types of medications, the different routes, and the different frequencies, and just make up a few sentences. And by the way, that one would be, necesita usar la crema en el área afectada 2 veces al día. So there's one example, but see if you can make up a few more examples, or maybe several of them, if you can remember enough vocab words to kind of mix and match to create some sentences of your own. All right, so medication instructions. Hopefully that was helpful. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you haven't already checked out the 5 very high-yield beginner lessons for providers, go to learnmedicalspanish.org/lessons, and I'll email those to you. And I'll put a link in the episode description and the video description. And if you're on YouTube, I've got a playlist here with a bunch of other medical Spanish dialogues and things of that nature. And then another playlist here that has a bunch of anatomy videos, medical Spanish anatomy. And if you're on the podcast, of course, you can just scroll down and kind of look for some of those same topics. All right, thanks for being here. I'll catch you next time.